All right, this is CS161 lecture number 26. This is the Signal protocol. As you can tell, we are in a slightly different medium because A, Signal protocol is kind of hard to make slides for. And B, this is an out-of-scope lecture, so don't worry about it too much if you don't have resources to study off of, because this will not be on the exam. Speaking of the exam, getting into announcements, we will have our exam on this Thursday. It'll be 5 to 8 is the normal time. Please do fill out the conflict form if you aren't able to make it. We're going to assign conflict times probably by the end of today or tomorrow, so keep an eye out for that, but please fill out the form as soon as you can. This week is the week of optional lectures, which is why there are only 9 people in here, and 2 of which are me and Parrot. So if you want to work on the project, if you want to study for the exam, feel free to do that like right now. If you want to leave and go do that instead of being here, that's totally all right. We understand. But since you are here, yeah, nothing to fill out if there's no conflict. But since you are here, why don't we get into the Signal protocol? I can give you one reason. It's that the screen's frozen and you can't see anything. All right, what we're going to do is I'm going to join this meeting from a separate device. And we're going to screen share that way. Sorry, everyone. Give me another while to get this figured out.
Recording in progress.
Oh, goodness. Okay. What you should hopefully see now is a slightly blurrier version of what you saw last time, but now it should hopefully stay in sync. So there's that. So, okay, we can finally get into the lecture content now. The Signal protocol, I guess going into some background really quickly, the Signal protocol is a protocol that's used in a messaging app called Signal. So if you have ever spent enough time in the security community and you've asked like, oh, what do you text with? Chances are at some point someone has told you, oh, I use Signal. And maybe they'll give you their phone number to add them on Signal or something. I don't know. But Signal is this messaging app that was built as open source software. So anyone can look at the code and see, oh, there's no backdoor here. And it's built with a very robust cryptography. So whereas something like Messenger on Facebook, Facebook can actually see your messages and read them if they really wanted to. With Signal, we have something called end-to-end encryption. So this is a topic that we've talked about a couple of times. End-to-end encryption is something that we want because it means that no man in the middle can read or modify our messages. So with the Signal protocol, what we're going to do is we're going to take some of the concepts that we've talked about and apply it to this messaging context. So before we get into that, we talked a bit about TLS. TLS does actually provide end-to-end security. Alice sends a TLS handshake, client hello to Bob. Bob responds with the server hello. They do a key exchange, and that's great. But that won't really work for us in a messaging context. With a web server, we can just assume that the web server is online. But with messaging services, we can't make that assumption. We have this idea that maybe Bob is on a plane, which is something that's slowly becoming more and more likely. So we still want Alice to be able to send messages to Bob, even if Bob is offline and he can't be there to conduct his part of the Diffie-Hellman key exchange. So some properties that we're going to have with our protocol, and I'm going to have some fairly poor handwriting, but hopefully you'll be able to make some sense of it. Let me make sure I have chat up open as well. All right, this is an asynchronous protocol. So this means that either Alice or Bob is going to be offline. We don't require that they're both online to do something like a key exchange. And then there are going to be a couple of security properties that we want. So the first one is something that we've talked about before. We want something called forward secrecy. Forward secrecy says that if, say, Eve is listening in the conversation between Alice and Bob, even if she records all of those messages and then later compromises the keys that Alice and Bob are using at the time, she can't go back in time to decrypt the messages that she recorded. So remember, something like Diffie-Hellman has this property that even if Eve records this G to the A and G to the B, Eve still can't go back later and learn the secret G to the AB, even if she compromises Alice's and Bob's computers because they've deleted G to the AB by then. So we want the same sort of property. If Alice sends a message to Bob and Eve is recording it, we don't want it such that if she later breaks into Alice's device and learns all of the keys on her device, we don't want Eve to be able to go back in time and decrypt those messages. There's also another property we want called deniability. So this is not something that we talked about. Well, it was something, deniability. Yes, we got it. This is something we almost talked about during the end of the cryptography module, but we did not get to it because that lecture was really long. But deniability is the concept that there should be no evidence that Alice can publish that proves that Bob sent a message. So even if Bob sends Alice a message, there's nothing that Alice has that she can publish to cryptographically prove that Bob sent a message. You might think of something like a Mac might have this property. You need, or for something like HMAC at the very least, you can't verify a Mac without the key. So Alice, even if she publishes the Mac that Bob generated, A, this doesn't prove that Bob generated the Mac. It could be that Alice generated the Mac. And B, no one can verify this Mac unless they also have the key. And we're going to assume that Alice isn't going to publish the key here. So deniability is also something that we want from the Signal protocol. But yeah. Finally, we want another property we're going to call backward secrecy. I promise this is not just going to be me writing words on a thing. I will have diagrams at some point. Backward secrecy is kind of the opposite of forward secrecy. If we draw our sort of timeline of, let's say this right here is compromised. So Eve breaks into the device and learns the keys at this point. Forward secrecy says that if you go back in time, she cannot decrypt messages that she recorded here. So there's this sort of one-way property that from here to here, we can derive keys going from here to here, but we can't go back in time to decrypt past messages. What backward secrecy says, and this is maybe a little bit counterintuitive because we're going to go forwards in time, is that if Eve compromises this device and she's not continuing to be an active man in the middle, then at a certain point, our algorithm will recover itself such that even though she compromised the keys at this point, at a certain point onwards, she no longer has access to these messages again. So forward secrecy says she can't go back in time. This is something that we're going to achieve quite easily. Backward secrecy says that if she's not an active man in the middle at all times, she won't be able to go forwards of time either. So those are kind of the main security properties that we're going to have. We're going to show you how we build these along the way. So when we're talking about messaging protocols and we're talking about asynchronous protocols, one of the things we're going to realize is that simple one-time key exchanges and always using the same key isn't going to work out for us. In something like TLS, sure, I can conduct my handshake with the server, and maybe no one has learned my key with them at the time. But if I always hold on to that key and always use that to, say, send messages to the server later in the future, then we no longer have that forward secrecy guarantee. Because if we just hold on to the key and keep using the same key to send messages to someone, then if someone learns what that key is, they can go back in time. So then we don't have this forward secrecy property that we want. So what we need to do is we need to change keys. If you have finished project 2, this is probably something that you're somewhat familiar with, because in project 2, one of the things that you have to do in order to guarantee secrecy on your files is change the key on your file. Encrypt it with a different key, that now you know that the adversary doesn't know what this new key is. So if this is bringing back memories from project 2, it's okay, it's totally normal. In order to derive our new keys, we need something called a key derivation function. So we're going to, it's not introduce, you've used this function before, but this is HKDF, hash-based, we'll just go with hash key derivation function. I don't understand how professors do this. I feel like it takes a long time to write anything. This function, it's very similar to HMAC. If you look into it, actually, it might literally just be an HMAC function. But the guarantee is that if I have some key K here, and I put it through this magical HKDF algorithm, we'll just call it KDF, and I get back some new key K prime, this is a one-way function. If I have K and I put it through HKDF, I will get a new key. And from this new key, it is computationally infeasible to go the other way. So I can go from K to K prime, but I can't go from K prime back to K. That's not something that we can do. And by now, you can already start to see how we can have forward secrecy guarantees. We know that, okay, maybe we need some sort of exchange to get our original key here, but every time we send a message, maybe we can just generate a new key, send the message, and then we can just delete this old key. So now if we don't save this old key, they can't go back and decrypt old messages, but someone with the old key can still go forwards and decrypt newer messages. So this is kind of the construct that we're going to go with. The real construction of KDF that we're going to use is also going to have some kind of input. So we still have K and K prime. This is still a KDF function. But there's also going to be some additional input. Don't worry too much about what this input is right now. For a standard KDF invocation, we can just say that, this is some constant. Maybe it's 1. And if we keep doing this enough times, we have enough keys to send a bunch of different messages. We don't want to use, ideally, if we want the best kind of forward secrecy, we will only really use each key once. Sorry, I'm trying to keep track of my diagrams here. So let's see, why did I decide to use prime symbols? So if we encrypt our first message with K, and then encrypt our second message with K prime, encrypt our next message with K prime prime, move this up a little bit, encrypt the next message with K prime prime prime, then we can send all of our messages. So maybe we have encrypt M1 with K, comma, encrypt M2 with K prime, and so on and so forth. As soon as I, as the recipient of the message, receive some message encrypted with K, I can delete K. I no longer need K. I can just save the message. And now there's no information retained that allows me to decrypt this message ever again. Even though the message was sent encrypted across the wire, if I delete the key, I now have that forward secrecy guarantee. And that's what we want. If we go back to our diagram up here, if you just imagine we have this chain of keys, and we keep using this HKDF algorithm to generate new keys, then going in this direction is really easy. If we have some sort of shared key at this point in the timeline, we just keep deriving our newer and newer keys to send newer and newer messages. So that gives us our forward secrecy guarantee. But that doesn't give us backward secrecy. If someone ever compromises one of our keys, we're going to lose all of our security in the future. Because if someone, say, compromised this key right here, then they can just go forwards and keep deriving more and more keys. And now our security is lost, not only now, but forever. So HKDF is a wonderful primitive that we're going to build on very shortly, but it is used as our first ratchet algorithm. This is called a ratchet algorithm. If you're not familiar, a ratchet is really just like one of those wheels with, I don't know why this is going in the diagram. This is a ratchet. I think I spelled that right. Yeah. It's just one of those wheels that only turns one way, but not the other. So if you try to go the other way, you sort of catch on these spikes here. We call this a ratchet algorithm because you can only go one way through this chain. You can't go backwards. And this is what we're going to use for our Signal protocol. So that's great. We can achieve forward secrecy, but we still need some kind of backward secrecy. So if the only way that we can achieve secrecy in the presence of a man in the middle, or if the only way we can achieve secrecy in the presence of a on-path attacker is Diffie-Hellman, then what we're going to do is we're actually just going to do Diffie-Hellman multiple times. So this is where we introduce something called the double ratchet algorithm. Double ratchet. So back here is our first ratchet. Our first ratchet is just that we have this KDF algorithm that's going this way. We're going to call this our KDF ratchet. Number one, oops, sorry, I remember to keep it in frame. Number one is our KDF ratchet. The next thing we're going to do is we want this self-healing property that we talked about. If Mallory compromises their keys at some point and she stops being a man in the middle and she looks away for just a second, then we want to be able to recover our secrecy. So what we're going to do is we're actually just going to do Diffie-Hellman a lot of times. So this is where you need to step back for a moment and try to remember what exactly Diffie-Hellman is. In Diffie-Hellman, we have Alice and we have Bob. She has her private component A, public component G to the A. She has private component B, G to the B. Alice sends G to the A, Bob sends G to the B. So G to the B, G to the A. And then they can both derive G to the AB. We're sort of going to modify this a little bit. And what we're going to do is going to say, okay, hang on to this G or this A and G to the A for an extended period of time. So I'm going to lay things out a little bit differently. Let's just say that Bob, this is standard. Let's say that Bob, oh no, I've received a notification. I thought I turned those off. It's okay. We're going to say that Bob, I'm going to draw it a little bit differently because we're just going to represent keys as these sort of two-headed blobs here. Let's just say that this is a secret component B because it's on this side, it's facing away from Alice. And this is a public component G to the B. Bob is going to take this G to the B, send it to Alice. So Alice only receives the public component. And she's going to have a separate G to the A, G to the B. This is just the same thing from earlier. So this is A, G to the A. And whenever I do something like this, I'm going to connect this G to the A and this sort of A, G to the A here. And we're going to say this is a Diffie-Hellman. So this is a Diffie-Hellman. It just looks a little bit weird because I've laid it out differently, but fundamentally we're still doing the same operations. We have this G to the B, we're raising it to the power of A. You're going to see why I've laid it out like this really shortly. But what we can say is, okay, Alice has sent, or Bob has sent G to the B to Alice. Alice is just going to send G to the A back to Bob. So Bob receives G to the A like this. And now Bob can do the same Diffie-Hellman. Now let's think for a moment what the properties of this are. Remember, in the standard Diffie-Hellman, Alice and Bob end up deriving the same G to the AB. And in this sort of different diagram here, we've basically done the same thing again. Bob has his G to the B, sends G to the B to Alice. Alice has her G to the A, sends it to Bob. They are using the same components, so they do the same Diffie-Hellman, and we're going to say that they arrive at the same key. Let's just say they both arrive at this, and the diagram sort of looks like this. This is a K, this is a K, and then the same key. But now what we can do is Bob is, let's say Alice is offline. So Alice can't send any new G to the A's right now. And Bob says, okay, that's actually fine. As long as either G to the A or G to the B are different, we're going to get a different key. But Alice has already sent me a G to the A. I know that she still remembers her original A. So what I can actually do, if I go down a little bit, is generate a new G to the B and B. And I'm just going to reuse her old G to the A here. So if I connect the lines like that, I get a slightly different Diffie-Hellman. Well, I say slightly different, it's a completely different Diffie-Hellman. And I'll get a new key, K prime. All right, and Alice did not have to be online for any of this. Alice already sent her G to the A a while ago. She's completely offline, but we can still generate a new component for us, G to the B and B, and do a new Diffie-Hellman. So Bob was online, he can do this. Alice sent hers a while ago, and we're just going to reuse her component for a new Diffie-Hellman. And even if Alice, or even if someone has compromised this key here, if they don't man in the middle this communication right here, they're not going to be able to learn K prime. And Bob sends his G to the B over, and eventually Alice is going to receive it. We're assuming that Bob can send things to Alice, and Alice is, even though she's not online, she'll receive it eventually. So eventually, when Alice does receive Bob's G to the B, she remembers, oh, I used that A a while ago. I'm just going to use it one more time in this new Diffie-Hellman, and I can generate the same key, this K prime. These are equal. And we can continue this process. Let's say that Bob is offline now. Alice is the one sending a message. She's going to generate her A and G to the A, going to do another Diffie-Hellman. This generates yet another K prime prime, and sends G to the A over to Alice. Bob, when he comes online, he does his own Diffie-Hellman, and he can derive the same key, K prime prime. So this is what we're going to call our Diffie-Hellman ratchet. I'll just call this the DH ratchet. And we kind of have the same properties here. I guess it's not a ratchet function in the way you normally think about it. It's not just like a one-way function. But what this ratchet is going to do is it's going to give us the ability to, again, heal from compromises. So if Mallory compromises the keys at this point and she doesn't man in the middle and tamper with one of these Diffie-Hellman key exchanges, we're going to be able to use those key exchanges to recover our secrecy again. So keep these two primitives in mind. We're going to put them together. So I guess this isn't the, all right, let's go like that. Actually, no, I need a new sheet of paper. This is not enough. So we'll put that away from now. This is the Diffie-Hellman ratchet. This is the KDF ratchet. And we're going to set these aside. We're going to build a primitive on top of this. So this is kind of where I need you to think back to this constant here. We said that this constant was the same every time, but we still have our one-way property here. If the adversary doesn't know either of these, so if it's a constant, we can assume the adversary knows it because Shannon's maxim. But now even if they know K prime, but they don't know this constant here, they still can't derive this K double prime here. So you need both of the inputs in order to derive the output of the KDF. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to take this output of the Diffie-Hellman and we're going to plug it in to our KDF. And that's going to give us some very robust security guarantee. So I'll show you what that looks like very shortly. Remember that we're in a messaging setting, so we want different keys going each way. And I'll show you how that works very shortly. So first, we're going to have just a Diffie-Hellman ratchet going on over here. we're going to say we have a set of root keys over here. We're going to say we have a sending set of keys over here. We're going to have a root set of keys over here. What do we start with? You can assume that, let's just say we're Alice and we want to send a message to Bob. We can assume that somehow we start with a public key that Bob has given us. Don't worry about how this works. We can get into that if we have time later. Assume that we have some symmetric root key. So this is just some symmetric key. So this is asymmetric key. This is a symmetric key. And then from here, we're going to derive our sending keys and our receiving keys. The first thing we want to do is, well, we've received this public component. Let's do a Diffie-Hellman with it. So we're going to generate our own a g to the a, and we will do a Diffie-Hellman. So this is a Diffie-Hellman. And what we're going to do is we're going to put our root key through this ratchet here. So remember, this is just a KDF. The output of this Diffie-Hellman, which we can assume the attacker does not know, is going to get fed into this KDF, and we're going to generate a new root key. Let's just call it another RK. What have we done here? Well, if the adversary has compromised the root key, they still cannot know the value of this root key down here because we've just done a Diffie-Hellman. Well, I mean, we haven't even sent G to the A yet, so we can assume that they haven't compromised this Diffie-Hellman. And then even if they know this input, they don't know the side input to the KDF, so they don't know this new root key here. So what we've done is we've basically said, even if they did somehow compromise this key, they still cannot learn the new root key that we're going to use. This is sort of the key that we're going to use as our main key that keeps ticking onwards. That's the original ratchet that we have all the way back here. But we kind of want a separate set of keys for actually sending messages. You would imagine that I wouldn't want to use the root keys directly for encrypting. I only want keys for one purpose at a time. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to say that we take this key and we actually split it off into a different key. So this is some sending key, and this is going to be its own chain. So we're just going to call this a chain key, CK. Immediately we know, okay, we derived this from this. I think in the actual algorithm, you literally just add 32. So this is RK plus 32. Don't worry about it too much. But the key is the adversary can derive this from this. So we don't want that. We're going to immediately put this through its own KDF algorithm and derive a new chain key. So remember, if the adversary learns this, they still can't go backwards and learn the original chain key, and that means they can't learn the root key. But we don't want to encrypt messages directly with this either, because let's say later on we need yet another chain key, because this is a chain. If we encrypted a message with this key directly, then we're using the key as the chain. We don't want to use this key for encryption as well. So what's actually going to happen is we're going to, oh, I'm running out of room. All right. Put this through a slightly different KDF, and this is going to be our first real key. We can call this our sending key. Because this is Alice, we'll just call this A1. Why not? And how these KDFs are different are just that they have a different constant input. So this one has 0 as an input. This one has 1 as an input. So if the adversary compromises A1, which is used to actually send the message, they can't go back through this KDF to learn CK, and that means they can't learn our root key. Once we want another key, we're basically just going to do the same thing. So we derived a chain key, or we derived our sending key from this chain key up here. So we're actually going to do the same thing. We say that, okay, from our chain key, we're going to derive the next chain key using a KDF of input of 0, and we're going to derive our next sending key with an input of 1. So this is our A2. And you can see this is basically what we did before, but we're kind of adding on some extra guarantees. We know that, okay, we're using this to derive our chain keys for the future. And because we're using it for this purpose, we want completely separate keys in order to actually encrypt the message. Remember, one key for one purpose. So this provides us with our forward secrecy. And I'll sort of draw out a diagram of what happens if each of these keys is compromised. But this is the general idea for how our KDF ratchet works. If we send a message using A1, and then the A1 is later compromised, we can't go back and derive A2 because we can't go back through this KDF, so we can't derive these chain keys. So that's our first sort of main robust security guarantee that we want. But if the chain key is compromised, then they can learn, oh no, I should probably actually make sure that notifications don't pop up. Give me a moment. Or actually, I'll just wait till it happens again. All right. So let's say that Bob has come online now. Let's say that out of some freak accident, our root key has been compromised. Well, that's okay. So first of all, we're going to send our public component to Bob because that's just what you do in a Diffie-Hellman. At some point, Bob is going to receive this GDA, and then Bob can do this Diffie-Hellman and then derive these same set of keys because Bob is starting with the same root key and he has the private component for this G to the B. Later on, we're going to receive another G to the B. So we receive this, we go, okay, we know that Bob used the same G to the A as before, except this time he used his new B. So we're just going to put this through another Diffie-Hellman, which is going to be right here so that this diagram hopefully doesn't get too cluttered. And we're going to do a new Diffie-Hellman. This goes all the way down through another KDF, and we get a new root key. Now, let's think about this from Bob's perspective for a moment. Bob, when he did the Diffie-Hellman with the public component we sent him, he was deriving these keys, but we use these keys to encrypt messages to Bob. So Bob is using these keys to decrypt messages to him. That means the component that he sent us, he's using this Diffie-Hellman in order to actually send messages to us. So the first Diffie-Hellman he did was to receive messages from us. That means the second Diffie-Hellman must be to send messages to us. If he's sending messages to us, we're receiving messages from him. So what we're going to do is we bring this all the way over here. And this is going to be our receiving chain. I just realized I've written root up here. This is receiving. And so we have some chain key here. And again, we say, this is not good. We don't want to just add 32 to our key. So we're going to introduce a KDF just to prevent the adversary from learning our keys. And again, we're going to do two KDFs. And this one has 1 as an input. This one has 0 as an input. And this is going to be our first receiving key. So we call this B. Let's say B1, and let's say he sent 2 messages to us. So we do another KDF. We've got another chain key. And on this side, we got B2. So keep in mind, Bob can do this while we're offline. He has everything he needs to just keep doing KDF. So if we never send him a Diffie-Hellman, that's okay. He can still keep ticking these keys onward. Ooh, I should probably not reveal too many things about 161 through these notifications. I'll think about whether I want to stop that soon. Okay. So let's say that Bob sent 2 messages to us. We derived the keys that he used, and now we want to send some messages back to him. What we're going to do is we do our own Diffie-Hellman. So again, we do a new A, G to the A, do a Diffie-Hellman right here. And let's think about what we've just derived. We know that previously, this Diffie-Hellman Bob used to send messages to us. So the next Diffie-Hellman he's going to do is to receive messages from us. And likewise, we're going to do this next derivation to send messages to Bob. So you can kind of see we've got this back and forth pattern going on here. Root key, and this is used for our next sending chain. And I'm not going to talk through this too much more because hopefully you're starting to get the gist of how this works. KDF, this would be, say, A prime 1. I don't know. And let's just say we do this one more time. This is A prime 2, and so on and so forth. So this is, let's see if I can zoom out a bit. This is the, no, that's not really legible. This is the full double ratchet algorithm. And we see that we get all the guarantees that we wanted here. Well, maybe not all the guarantees. Oh, I'll get into how we do deniability in a moment because it kind of happens in a different part of the key exchange. But we get forward secrecy because anytime Bob sends us a message, or anytime we send Bob a message, we will increment this chain key and then derive a completely separate sending key. So if, for example, the adversary compromises one of our sending keys, he only learns one of the messages. So let's say they compromise sending or receive key is compromised. If we have our timeline here, let's say that every large tick mark is a Diffie-Hellman, and every small one is just a message. If they only learn one of our message keys, so one of our sending or receiving keys, then they cannot go back through this KDF. So they can't go, they can't go back and read our previous messages because they can't learn A1 by going back through here. And likewise, if they learn A1, they can't go forwards to learn A2 because they still can't go back to this KDF, and thus they can't go down this chain. So remember that each of these boxes, you can only go down through it. You can't go back up. So if they compromise the sending or receiving key, they can only learn one message. One message. All right. What if they compromise a chain key? Well, CK compromised. We do our diagram again. I'm realizing that this is a really intensive diagram, so I might do it less cleanly from here on out. Let's say they've compromised a chain key right here. Well, let's say they compromise this chain key down here. We're going to add an extra one just to make it a little bit more apparent. F. And this would be B3. If they compromise one of the chain keys down here, we know that, okay, they can go down and derive B3, but they can't, or let's say they compromise this chain key down here. They can go and derive B2 and B3. So the rest of the sending keys in this chain are compromised, but they can't go back and compromise B1, because again, they can't go back to this KDF. So if a CK is compromised, then all of these messages here are compromised. Up until the next Diffie-Hellman. So remember, these ratchets sort of reset themselves when we do a new Diffie-Hellman. So it's compromised all the way up until a Diffie-Hellman happens. So this is forwards until next Diffie-Hellman. So already we can kind of see we're trying to build as many guarantees as we want, such that if the adversary compromises any of the keys here, they're still only going to be able to mess with our communications for a limited amount of time. All right, let's say that something worse happens. Let's say they compromise this root key. All right, so we've talked about the sending and receiving keys. We've talked about these chain keys. Now we're going to talk about the root keys. So the root keys, they are the root. It sounds like it would be pretty bad if they compromised it. And, to an extent it would be. I'm only going to draw tick marks here because I can't be bothered. If they compromise this root key, we know that it can get to this chain key because it's not that hard to do that. That's why I've sort of connected these lines. It's really just adding 32. So we know that this entire chain is compromised, but previous root keys are still safe because we go through this KDF, there's no way to go backwards. And assuming that they haven't tampered with this Diffie-Hellman here, even though they know this input to the KDF, let me zoom back in so you can see. Even though they know this input to the KDF, they don't know this Diffie-Hellman output because we assume they haven't tampered with it. So the moment we do a new Diffie-Hellman, we have a completely new chain, and the adversary has not compromised this chain whatsoever. So even if they compromise the root key, they've only compromised one of our chains. And we'll get into exactly how long these chains are in a moment. But let's say they compromise the root key here. They can go backwards, learn all of that, learn all of this, one chain until Diffie-Hellman. All right. And finally, there's sort of the edge case of what happens if they compromise the Diffie-Hellman. Well, if they compromise the Diffie-Hellman, but they don't know the root key, they haven't learned anything. So even if they've met in the middle of this Diffie-Hellman, if they never gained access to this root chain here, they're still not going to have access. So even though they know this input down here, they don't know this input, so they can't derive this next root key. So what does a successful adversary have to do to compromise this set of keys here? The adversary has to, A, compromise one of the root keys, and be a man in the middle for every single one of these Diffie-Hellmans. Now you might think, okay, that's a pretty easy assumption. We can always just assume that they're always a man in the middle. But in reality, that might be a little bit more difficult than you'd expect. Being a man in the middle requires either that you have full access to, I guess in this case, Signal servers. The Signal is the one who's handling the passing of these messages, or you have to be some sort of powerful network attacker that also compromises the encrypted channels between Alice and the Signal server and Bob and the Signal server. So both of those are kind of difficult situations. I guess the best threat model that could possibly do this is the Signal server itself. But you can more or less assume that almost all adversaries will not A, have access to our root chain, and B, be a man in the middle for all of these Diffie-Hellmans. And the key is you need to be both. If you don't have both, if you're missing just one of these components, you're not going to be able to compromise any of these keys. So that's the double ratchet algorithm. At a very high level, is basically just built of two main ratchets here. Our sending and receiving chains, these are the KDF ratchets. They say we can go forwards, but we can't go backwards, and only if you've compromised a chain key. And we have our Diffie-Hellman ratchet that basically says just create new KDF ratchets so that if, say, the adversary has man in the middle this Diffie-Hellman, but not this one, then the next time we do a KDF for the root chain, we'll regain our confidentiality guarantees. That is the double, here, I'll write this out, double ratchet. That's the double ratchet algorithm, and that provides us both this forward secrecy and backward secrecy, and I guess in general, the robust security guarantees that you have from this algorithm. And all of these are still just symmetric keys, so you can encrypt the messages however you want. And all we needed are a public key that Bob has to start with, and some root key that we had to start with. All right, questions on this? All right. Why don't we take a, let's say 5-minute break till 4:32, and then we'll come back. And again, this is an optional lecture for those of you who came in a bit late. This is an optional lecture, so feel free to leave if you would like to work on project 3 or study for the exam. But if you want to stay around, happy to have you. How do I stop recording? Oh, there we go. If you are watching the recording because you are interested in cryptography and not because this is on the exam, because it's not, you missed nothing because no one said anything during the break, but that's okay. I think everyone's tired. So let's look back at the assumptions we made for the double ratchet algorithm. The main assumptions we had are that there's this magical root key that we have that somehow we share with Bob, and we have this magical key or public key that we received from Bob, and somehow we trust that this is from Bob and not from some adversary. So how do we actually arrive at these keys? This is where something called extended triple Diffie-Hellman is. If it sounds like just a lot of Diffie-Hellmans, you're mostly there. Extended triple Diffie-Hellman. This is really just going to be a Diffie-Hellman that we do multiple times, and it's going to provide us with more robust integrity and authenticity guarantees than we get from a standard Diffie-Hellman like we might do in TLS. Again, remember that the main problem that we have is that we are asynchronous. So again, Bob's phone might be offline. I'm slowly learning that I can't write and speak at the same time. The main problem that we have is that this is asynchronous. Bob's phone must be offline. Sort of the logical implication that we have here is that we need Bob to generate keys ahead of time. Kind of the implication there. If Bob's not online, Bob has to generate his keys beforehand. So down here, we're going to have Alice. We're going to have Bob. Now, we have 5 keys going on in this protocol. Remember, Alice is online, so she can do anything that she wants. Bob is offline, so all of these have to be keys that he publishes before. We're going to say that Alice and Bob have 2 long-term identity keys. So there's some, let's try this again. There's some IKA and IKB. And these are just really associated with their identities. In project 2, you almost definitely had some public keys that were associated with some user. And this is basically the same thing. These are long-term public keys that are associated with each user. Bob is also going to have something called a signed pre-key. So this is SPKB. And this signed pre-key is going to be the key that we use right here. So I'll get into how this fits into the double ratchet algorithm in a moment, but this is a key that is needed for future communications. And then he's going to have a bunch of one-time pre-keys. So OPK B1, OPK B2, OPK B3. And these exist to provide basically a one-time nature to these keys. IKB and SBKB might be used multiple times because multiple people might want to talk to Bob, but these one-time keys, ideally, we only want to use one of these per handshake. Alice, she has her IKA, and what she's going to tell the server is, I would like to talk to Bob. Now, remember, to talk to Bob, Bob has to have these public keys and has to have uploaded them beforehand. So Bob is actually going to generate all of these keys ahead of time. He's going to save the private keys locally, and the public keys are going to be sent to the server. So all of these are just saved on the server. They're just public keys, so it's fine for the server to hold on to them. Alice says, I would like to talk to Bob. What the server sends Alice is Bob's identity key, Bob's signed pre-key, and one of Bob's one-time pre-keys. OPK, yeah, one Bob's keys. And these three keys together make something called a pre-key bundle. Don't worry about it too much. Basically, Alice knows these three keys now. Could have been OPK B1, B2, so on and so forth. Let's just say we used OPK B1 for, because it's the closest one to Alice. Alice, she also wants to introduce some sort of one-timeness to this algorithm. So she's going to generate an ephemeral key, EKA. We say this is ephemeral because Alice is online. She can do this immediately and then delete it once she's done with it. Because she's online, she can do anything she wants. Now, I haven't actually told you what the algorithm for these keys are yet. That is because these are not RSA keys and they're not DSA or Elgamal keys. These are actually Diffie-Hellmans. So again, remember that in Diffie-Hellman, I have the diagram here somewhere. Yeah, in the standard Diffie-Hellman, we have the public components and the private components. And we can actually just consider these to be public and private keys. We can say A is Alice's private key and G to the A is Alice's public key. So the key here is that all of these are really just B, G to the B pairs. This is some B, G to the B. This is some B, G to the B. This is some A, G to the A. This is some A, G to the A. So we can do Diffie-Hellmans across any one of these, any pairs of keys that we want. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a Diffie-Hellman between IKA and SPKB. So here, again, IKA is really just G to the A, SPKB is just G to the B. Alice has this extra A here for IKA, so she can do this Diffie-Hellman. She's going to do another one between EKA and IKB. She's going to do one between EKA and SPKB, and she's going to do one between EKA and OPKB1. All right, let's number these out really quickly. This is number 1, this is number 2, this is number 3, this is number 4. All right, let's talk about why we did each of these. Well, for 1 and 2, we see that these involve these long-term identity keys. Again, these are keys that are associated with Alice and Bob for pretty much the duration of their account, unless they specifically choose to reset it. We assume that these are basically just an identifier for Alice and Bob. So if we do a Diffie-Hellman that includes IKA and IKB, then we can authenticate Bob and Alice respectively. IKA and IKB, Alice and Bob respectively. Because we do a Diffie-Hellman that includes their public keys, we assume that only people that have the private keys for IKA and IKB can derive the same key, these same Diffie-Hellmans, and thus they say that Alice and Bob must be the ones communicating in this protocol. As a side note, you might be wondering, why not just do a Diffie-Hellman key exchange between IKA and IKB? The main reason there is because this would just produce the same result every time. So anyone can see what the Diffie-Hellman result of IKA and IKB is if they compromise Alice and Bob's account. So we only really care about Diffie-Hellmans that include one of the ones down here because these are more ephemeral, they're more one time. That's 1 and 2. 3 is really just to give us this forward secrecy, since EKA and SPKB, these are sort of more short-term keys. So EKA is definitely short-term because Alice is only generating this for this one key exchange. SPKB, it hangs around for a while, but Bob will update this fairly often because, again, this SPKB is what's going to get plugged into this first Diffie-Hellman ratchet here. So we want this to change every now and again. Finally, 4 is really just the same thing, but more. Remember that the one-time pre-keys, the server will actually only send each of these to one person, after which they're deleted from the server. So 4 is basically just the same thing as 3, except instead of doing EKA and SPKB, it does EKA and OPKB1. So SPKB is sort of Bob's not super short term, but it will always be guaranteed to exist. And OPKB1 is super short term, but if the server runs out of one-time pre-keys, then we sort of fall back on 3 to provide our ultimate one-wayness. So again, each of these provides nice properties that we want. 1 authenticates Alice, 2 authenticates Bob, 3 provides some guaranteed forward secrecy, and 4 provides very well guaranteed forward secrecy, assuming that these keys are only used once. Once we have that, we're going to have these, we can call them subkeys K1, K2, K3, K4. What we're going to do is we're just going to mash them all together. So remember, each of these keys has some property that we want. We're just going to mash them together. So we say that our final secret SK is just a, oh, I don't remember if it's a hash function off the top of my head. I think it's a KDF. Let's just call it a KDF. Don't worry about the constant input. It's just a KDF of K1 concatenated. Oops, that's not concat. Concat K2, concat K3, concat K4. So what we've done is we've taken all of these keys and we've just mushed them together to form this SK that has all of the properties we want. We assume that you can't derive SK unless you are Alice or you are Bob. And this SK has the forward secrecy and guarantees that we want from Diffie-Hellmans in general. There's a question that comes up sometimes. Why is this called extended triple Diffie-Hellman if there are 4 of them? That is a very good question, and I don't have the answer to that. Presumably, it's because these one-time keys aren't guaranteed to exist, so there could only be 3. But more often than not, your phone's going to be able to send some new one-time keys to the server from time to time, so usually there are going to be 4. So how does this plug into the double ratchet algorithm that we talked about? Well, again, this SPK is used for this G to the B, and this secret key is going to be the first root key that we have. And remember, like even with these robust security guarantees, we immediately put this through a KDF. So an adversary needs to compromise both the secret component of the SPKB and the secret key in order to even have a chance at compromising these communications, assuming they didn't later break into their devices. So are there questions on extended triple Diffie-Hellman and how this works? All right, really quickly, I wanted to talk about deniability and one attack that you might have thought about already. So really quickly, the reason we have deniability is because at no point was anything ever signed. How do I word this? At no point did someone sign someone else's component. So at no point did Bob like generate a signature over something that Alice sent. And at no point did Alice generate a signature over something that Bob sent. The only signature that happened here is that Bob signed this pre-key with his identity key. And this gives us deniability because you can't really prove that this Diffie-Hellman key exchange happened because all of these messages are really just G to the A, G to the A, G to the B, G to the B, G to the B. Nothing here proves that Alice and Bob ever communicated. And similarly, when we look at our Diffie-Hellman ratchet, it's the same thing. You might think, oh, you know, why didn't we just sign new components using Bob's identity key since we have a long-term identity key now? And the reason is we don't want evidence of us ever sending a signed thing to Alice because that would prove that Alice and Bob are communicating. And we want that deniability. We want there to never be any cryptographic proof that Alice and Bob are communicating. Why you might want this, you can use your imagination. Maybe you're forbidden to talk to someone, and if someone can present cryptographic proof that you talked to someone, you will be in trouble. That's obviously a contrived example, but there are examples of deniability deniability is a useful feature to have in general. And if you can have it, it's better to have it than to not have it. Now, going back to this, if you are the server, remember that as the server, you're the one serving keys to Alice. what's an attack you might do if you want to tamper with these communications? So let's say that Alice doesn't know any of these keys. Alice has just asked you as the server for Bob's keys. If you wanted to be malicious, what would you do? This is not a trick question. It's very similar to the standard Diffie-Hellman. No one? All right. So in the standard Diffie-Hellman, the way we could tamper with those communications is instead of, I'll draw it on the back here. When Alice sends her G to the A, we block it, and instead we send a malicious, say, G to the M. We are Mallory, we are sending G to the M. So we're making it look like Alice sent a different component. And Alice has her A, G to the A, Bob has his B, G to the B, and we are evil, we have our M, G to the M. And if we tamper with this communication, then Bob is going to derive G to the BM, Alice is going to derive G to the AM, because Bob is going to try to send G to the B, and block that. Instead, we send G to the M. And now we know both of these keys because we have G to the A and G to the B, and we have M. So we can derive both of the keys that Alice and Bob are going to use and then be a man in the middle. You'll notice the server can do the exact same thing here. IKB is just a key that exists, and there's no way for us to prove that this key belongs to Bob. So as the server, we could block that, send our own IKM instead, maybe as Mallory, let's say. Signed SPKB is the same thing. It's signed by the identity key, but if we're forging the identity key, we might as well forge a signature over a forged signed pre-key. So we can forge this as well. And these are all just one-time pre-keys that are one time, we can generate our own. So we could send a packet of keys to Alice, and all of these keys just belong to the server. And that would kind of break a lot of this. So as a man in the middle, if you know if you know all of the private component for all of these keys, you can derive all of these Diffie-Hellmans. And thus that would give you access to this, because this is just the signed pre-key that you sent to Alice. And this can be derived from all of these Diffie-Hellmans. And then as a man in the middle, you can go down and derive all of these. So that seems pretty bad, right? We just said, oh, we want to defend against man in the middle attackers. And yeah, for most adversaries, it's hard to be a man in the middle at all times and not let a single Diffie-Hellman accidentally slip by. But we still have that last adversary of what if the server is malicious itself. And here's sort of where we run into the fundamental problem, because if you don't have trust, if you recall, this is something that we talked about all the way back in, I think, certificates. If you don't have trust in anything, you cannot gain trust sort of out of thin air. So just by having the server send us stuff, we can't implicitly somehow trust that these are from Bob. This means that somehow we have to prove that this IKB is real. We don't need to prove SPKB because SPKB is signed by IKB, and we don't need to prove these because these are one-time keys and we can get enough authenticity guarantees from the other keys. So how do you prove that Alice and Bob are in fact using the same set of identity keys? Because presumably Alice and Bob know that, okay, this is IKA and this is IKB. But if they receive different keys, we know that there has been a man in the middle. And the way you do that is you need some sort of out-of-channel communication. Remember, you can't gain trust just through an untrusted channel. There's no way of doing that. That is theoretically impossible. But if you have some out-of-band channel that you can use to communicate, oh, like these are the keys I'm using, oh, those are the keys you're using, and you can trust that out-of-band channel, then you can gain trust for that untrusted channel. And what you need, again, what you need to prove is we're just using the same IKA and IKB because everything else sort of follows in there. And so you do that through something called a, what is it called? It's a security code, if I remember correctly. And this is really just IKA and IKB. We're going to concatenate them, assume that we know what order to concatenate them. Say Alice, let's say Alice always comes up before Bob. And we're just going to encode that in some human readable form. So maybe this is a hash function and you want to compare hashes. Maybe the encode function term hashes them into a string of numbers just to make them easier. But we know that if Alice and Bob are using the same IKA and IKB, then they're going to have the same encodings. And so you can just compare their encodings, their hashes, if you want to think about it that way. And if the hashes are the same, then we know that they're using the same keys. Then we know that none of these keys have been compromised. And then we know that this chain here is secure. So what does that look like? Well, if you've used Messenger secret chats, or if you've used WhatsApp, or if you've used Signal, and there are a couple other services that do this as well, you'll see that, let's see if I can find someone I'm talking to on Signal. That's not myself, oops. I will use the previous person that I co-lectured with for the Signal lecture. So if you go on these apps, you'll see that there is something called a safety number. So I'll go all the way over here and no farther. This is really just the encoding of both of our identity keys. I can go and see, in this case, Ben, in person. I realized I could have used Perrin for this. Oh, well, sorry, Perrin. I can go in person and check, okay, your number is 09248, so on and so on and so on. And then I'll look at his phone. His phone generated 09248, so on and so on and so on. And I know, okay, these must be the same keys. This means that no one has manned in the middle our communications. Manned in the middle? I don't know how to make that past tense. And this means that the rest of this is secure. And it's also encoded as a QR code here because this is just a different encoding of the two keys, and scanning them is basically just an easier way of communicating my code is 09248. So this is the out-of-band channel that you use to verify someone else. I'd show you the examples on WhatsApp, on Messenger, but I think you sort of get the idea, and they're all basically the same thing. But with the trust that you get from the out-of-band verification to prove that this extended triple Diffie-Hellman was not compromised, and the security guarantees of all of the double ratchet things, of the double ratchet algorithms that mean you have forwards and backwards secrecy, you have very robust security guarantees when it comes to messaging apps. The apps that use this are Signal. WhatsApp uses a closed source implementation of this. Messenger secret conversations, which pretty much no one has used, also uses an implementation of this. And there are a couple of other apps that use the Signal protocol as well. The Signal protocol is what you get when you put both of these together. And they provide very robust security guarantees for your messaging in an asynchronous format that requires very little trust other than verifying each other's out-of-band communication through out-of-band verification. And that's basically it. Are there any final questions before we end just on time? All right, if not, that is all that I have for you today. If you really do not like cryptography, there will be other special topics. Tomorrow's is about electronic voting. It'll have a little bit of cryptography, but it'll have a lot of, let's say, human factors in it as well. And if you really just don't want to think about anything that even mentions the word cryptography, Wednesday will be featuring Perrin, who will be talking about how you can exploit Super Mario Bros. 3 with buffer overflows and gain a world record in the process. But yeah, that is all that I have for you today. See you, everyone.